The following is an Operation Podcast production.
What do you think is the biggest problem facing our health today that is not talked about enough?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think the big gorilla in the room is, I think it's 70% of Americans are consuming ultra-processed foods every day.
Still?
Yes. And even with that, understanding, if you look at the research, that we are consuming an additional minimum 500 additional calories a day if we are consuming ultra-processed foods on the regular. Segue and also add the other thing that I think contributes to a great deal of the disease that we're seeing is, as a culture, we don't value the role of strength training enough. We don't value the role of maintaining and building muscle throughout our lifetime. I think back, had I known at 20 that I was going to miss out on opportunities to build healthy bone and muscle, the first site in our bodies that become insulin resistant are our muscles. That is how important muscles are. It's not just about aesthetics.
What is overhyped in health right now?
I think that there is a great deal of emphasis on minutia.
How important is our sex health as it relates to our overall health?
I think that this is not addressed enough, so I'm glad that you're bringing it up in conversation. Sexual health is a litmus for many other things in our lives. Unfortunately, I think testosterone gets all the focus, and I think estrogen plays just as much of a role. So younger women sometimes getting testosterone replacement, they're like, oh, this is going to fix my libido. And then they're like, no, that did not fix my libido. It is not just in your head. I mean, if you don't have your hormones optimized, it is going to make the desire to have sex much more challenging. And I can tell you, after 25 years of working in medicine, we're not heading in the right direction. We truly aren't. Hi, I'm Cynthia Thurlow. I'm a nurse practitioner, and welcome to EverForward Radio.
Virginia in the house. For those of you that don't know, Cynthia actually came in from my sort of kind of hometown.
Yes.
Is it okay if I talk about? Okay.
Sure, absolutely.
I saw it in an email signature, so I assume it's out there. But Richmond, Virginia, and I think you're not far from my mom and stepdad. Actually,
I'm probably 5 minutes away. The great state of Virginia.
The great state, VA. I love all my VA people.
Yes.
For those in the audience who have never heard of you, this is their first time kind of learning about you and all the things we're going to get into. Can you give us a quick breakdown of your expertise, professional background, medical background, just to kind of set the stage of who is this lady and why is she talking about this stuff?
Exactly. Well, I started as an ER nurse in inner city Baltimore. I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and I transitioned from being an ER nurse to working in cardiology as an NP for 16 years. And over the course of those 16 years, I absolutely love everything related to the heart. But I grew increasingly disillusioned with the traditional allopathic model, which was really just focused on addressing symptoms and really not looking a little deeper at the role of lifestyle. And around that same time, I had a child that had life-threatening food allergies. And I read a book called The Unhealthy Truth, which I always credit for changing my life. Sometimes it's amazing how impactful a book can be. And so Robin O'Brien's book, I read that, it made me angry, realizing how our food has been so adulterated and is driving a lot of the food sensitivities, food allergies that we're seeing in not just in children, but also in adults. And so in 2016, I woke up one morning and told my husband I would not work another day in that model, and that I knew that I would be successful. And that was as much of a business plan as I had, was that I had this blind faith that I could make a larger impact by leaving traditional allopathic medicine. And in 2016, I took a leap of faith and started a business, which initially was really serving women in perimenopause and menopause. So, every woman that's north of 35, early 40s, mid 40s is probably struggling with the same problems that I was having. And so I attracted a growing group of women that were in group programs and one-on-one work. And as an introvert, I decided I was going to do something big and scary. And so I decided to do a TED Talk. The TED Talk turned into two separate TED Talks, but one of which went viral, talking about intermittent fasting. And so
15 million views, kind of viral, everybody. Yeah.
A real viral entity. And so that changed the trajectory of everything. All of a sudden, there were opportunities that were opened up to me and allowed me to speak on a lot of different platforms and, grow my podcast and write a book. And now I humbly sit back and say, 8 years ago when I made that prediction about being able to make a larger impact, that was a real thing.
Yeah.
And so most people know me for intermittent fasting, but I would say the majority of people follow me for perimenopause, menopause, and stuff related to the podcast.
So I think you kind of addressed it in there, but to ask you directly, what was so compelling about healthcare in general that you decided to not only choose that as your career path, but keep that as your career path for so long?
Yeah. So when I was an undergrad, I was actually pre-law. So my first undergraduate degree was in international studies. I was going to go to law school, applied to law school, got in, and then decided not to do it. And around that same time, I happened to get a dog. I'd always wanted a pet. My parents were divorced. It wasn't realistic. And getting that dog changed my life. I realized that I was passionate, interested in medicine. And so I went from working a full-time job to taking pre-med classes at the same time to then leaving to do full-time pre-med work and then trying to make a decision about, did I want to go to med school? Did I want to think about going into nursing, which my knee-jerk reaction was absolutely not, because my family is full of nurses and I don't want to do what everyone else has done. And so I really think that I ended up exactly where I was supposed to be. I have a mom who had a very, very successful career and wasn't home much. And I knew that if I became a physician, I would probably end up creating a similar path for myself.
She was a physician?
No, she actually ended up being a CIO of some very, very large medical systems, but was very, very involved in
the healthcare system in one way, yeah.
In a different way. And so I was sitting in a pharmacology class, and this professor looked at me and said, "What are you doing in here? You're, a couple of years older than the undergrads. What are you doing?" And so I told him, he said, "You don't want to be a physician. You want to be a nurse practitioner." I was like, No, I don't want to be an NP. I don't want to be a nurse. And he said, I think you should talk to my sister. And so he got me connected to his sister. And next thing I knew, I was applying to post-bac pre-med programs along with post-bac nursing programs. And so around that time, I was also very interested in HIV and AIDS. This was back when HIV was a death sentence, and I was working at a clinic in Washington, D.C. at the same time, and I realized, where are the two big centers in the United States for HIV? Hopkins and UCSF. And I'm very much an East Coast girl, so it was an easy decision. I went and visited Hopkins. I applied to a dual degree program to get an undergrad and a graduate degree. And so off I went to Baltimore, which at the time was not nearly as safer than it is now. And so I just got lit up. It was absolutely the right decision. Intellectually, I was around the smartest people I'd ever met and was so challenged. And, for me, helping and serving others is really at the basis of everything that I do. And so even now, even though I'm not working in that same environment as I once was, I still continue to serve people. And that's really, that's my mission. Like, I tell people, not jokingly, I was meant to be married to my husband and have my two boys. There's no question. But in terms of occupationally, what I'm doing now is the work that I was intended to do my entire life. It just took me a bit of time to figure it all out.
What was it specifically about having a dog that made you want to shift into healthcare?
I mean, it was such a crazy thing. I had always wanted a dog, and I just realized how much I enjoyed caring for her, as trite as that sounds. And
it's
really,
because dogs are the best.
They are. I have 3, which makes me sound a little crazy. But getting her just really changed the way I looked at the world and affirmed for me that being in some degree of service to others, and someone would probably ask, why didn't you become a vet? I'm allergic to cats, like horrifically, horribly allergic to cats. And so it was clear to me that I could handle taking care of dogs, but very likely would not have been a good small animal veterinarian. And so for me, I sit in complete gratitude that specific people and specific things have come along in my path in life that have affirmed for me that I ended up exactly where I was supposed to be. And I think for so many people, there's not enough stillness in their lives to acknowledge that when they have those moments. And for me, I think 2019 for me changed everything. And I always say there was the before 2019 and then there was the post-hospitalization.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm not the same person. And so now I really take notice of how I feel, the stillness, even coming to LA to do podcasts, people say, "Oh, what are you going to do every night?" And I was like, you don't understand. Like, I actually just enjoy not having so much on my plate. Like, do I feel like taking a walk? Do I want to order Uber Eats? What do I want to do?
Doing nothing out of your normal environment is like a vacation.
It truly
incredible.
is. I told my husband I'm going to read a book. So I'm pretty exciting. But no, I think it's so much of my life is forward facing that when I have the opportunity to be more introspective, to be quiet, that's what really recharges me ultimately.
I'm with you. Absolutely. Okay. So now I want to just kind of dive into a lot of questions that I have seen on the interwebs, a lot of trending topics in the health, fitness, wellness content space. So first up, what do you think is the biggest problem facing our health today that is not talked about enough?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think the big gorilla in the room is I think some of us are talking about nutrition. Some of us are talking about these things. But I think it's the combined, we use the term multifactorial in medicine, the combined effects of a sedentary lifestyle, this overly stressed, overly fixated culture. We don't talk enough about the poor quality nutrition that most, if not all of us, are consuming. I mean, I think it's 70% of Americans are consuming ultra-processed foods every day.
Still?
Yes. And even with that, understanding, if you look at the research, that we are consuming an additional minimum 500 additional calories a day if we are consuming ultra-processed foods on the regular. So I think about those things. Like, it's very easy to say, oh, it's the problem is this, the problem is that. Oh, we have an issue with toxins in our environment. Yes, we do. Do I think that's the primary driver of this poor health issue? I think it's these lifestyle-mediated issues that we don't talk enough about. And I would probably segue and also add the other thing that I think contributes to a great deal of the disease that we're seeing is, as a culture, we don't value the role of strength training enough. We don't value the role of maintaining and building muscle throughout our lifetime. And I'll give you an example. Many women, and I say this without judgment because I was on oral contraceptives from, probably my early 20s until I got married. At the peak bone and muscle mass years for women, they're kept in such a low estrogen state. They miss these opportunities to be able to build their peak bone and muscle mass. How does this show up? It shows up with women that are developing osteopenia, which I would argue is actually not a real diagnosis. It's just one of these outlier ramifications when they're looking at DEXA scans and bone health. But why are we dealing with such metabolic health issues? And a great deal of it is because if women, as an example, are on oral contraceptives to prevent pregnancy, which, I mean, that's an important thing. We can decide when we want to become parents. But at the expense of understanding that form of contraception is one example, is limiting our ability to build and maintain bone and muscle mass in our peak years. So they get into their 40s and they're already behind the curve. They're not as metabolically healthy with less muscle mass. They're going to probably be at greater risk for developing bone issues later in life. And, I'm living proof of this because I think the first time I had a DEXA scan done, it was like at a clinic example. I think it was the hospital I worked at. They were like, oh, let's check, we'll check a DEXA scan. You're one of the providers to come over here. And they're like, Cynthia, you're like 32 years old and your bones are already osteopenic. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate or understand what that meant. But they were like, now you need to have serial DEXA scans to monitor this. And the first thing I said to my GYN was, why would an otherwise healthy 32-year-old not have healthy bone density? Like, what would be, because I'm not anorexic, I've done plenty of exercise.
Yeah, why did that happen?
And the first thing she said to me was, you've been on oral contraceptives for years. And so I starting to put those things together. So getting back to your original question, I think there's many things that feed into this problem, but I think we don't talk enough and do enough for the nutrition piece. I think a great deal about, Dr. Casey Means and Callie Means and how they're bringing greater awareness to what's going on with
Shout out
processed
Good
food.
Energy. Yeah.
Yes, a great book. How they're trying to bring greater awarenesses, but these are tough discussions. People don't want to change lifestyle. It's hard to do that. I get it. But if we're not willing to change lifestyle, we're not going to change the trajectory that we're headed in. And I can tell you, after 25 years of working in medicine, we're not heading in the right direction. We truly aren't.
Where we are now with access to information, access to providers. Now, for a lot of different people, for a lot of different reasons, access still is limited for whatever reason. But with social media, with the internet, you still feel like healthcare, the healthcare industry as a whole, is not progressing in the right direction.
No, I think we do. We do a good job with emergencies. We do a good job with urgent needs.
Acute care.
Correct.
Yeah.
I benefited from that, when I was so sick. But we don't do a good job with prevention. We continue to do a really crappy job with chronic disease prevention and management. And the reason why is you start looking at metabolic disease, obesity, ASCVD, so atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, PCOS. You start to look at the rates and how they're escalating. Not to just mention, I think it's even more important that we reflect on the fact that we have more children that are developing metabolic diseases that we saw in adults. Type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I mean, you're starting to see adult diseases in children that are a reflection of lifestyle-mediated choices. And kids aren't choosing these things for themselves, right?
Yeah.
That's why I think, to me, that is a poor prognostic indicator for our future. If our children aren't healthier than we are, what is that demonstrating? And
that's a really good point. That's a really good point.
Yeah, and so I think that those are the things that keep me up at night, drive me crazy, because I've been witnessed, I've been privileged to be able to see the trajectory of what's gone on the last 25 years. And I listen to what my peers are telling me, my friends who are still in the trenches, still in the hospital, the things that they're seeing, and they would echo that. And so I think it's hopefully a wake-up call, like that we know that these things are preventable if we're making the right steps towards changing diet, getting more sleep, managing our stress. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
But understanding that the long-term payoff is huge. I mean, it is enormous. And because I was able to witness for all those years, especially in cardiology, because generally our patients didn't just have one problem, they had many problems. They were seeing many specialists. And understanding that most of the dietary information I was giving out, especially as a new nurse practitioner, I don't agree with. I think that, the whole concept of fat bastardization, thankfully that's starting to turn around. But the glorification of processed carbs and telling people to eat seed oils and things like that, that's the kind of information that I think the average person, if they did nothing else, like they take one actionable step after listening to this podcast, read food labels and avoid seed oils. If you did nothing else, that in and of itself would make a huge net impact on your health.
I recently, by the time this airs, this episode will have aired, Dr. Kate Shanahan.
I love Kate. I'm reading her book.
She just had her on. We just had her on. Comes out, I think, like next week.
Yep.
And I was blown. Very, very passionate, but very well researched and very well informed. And I was blown.
Well, and it's interesting that the last podcast that I did, the gentleman who was born outside the United States, and one of the first questions he asked me was, why are Americans so obese? And I said, I think there's a lot of things that impact that. And I said, unfortunately, we're now in this changing scope. What we see is and acknowledge as normal is not normal anymore. And so, like as an example, my husband, my kids and I, we went to Portugal for spring break. And if anyone that's listening has ever been to Portugal, I mean, the people are amazing. The food's unbelievable. I mean, you must go. It's incredible. And the one thing that consistently people would say, why are Americans so obese?
Really? They would just ask
they weren't asking to be rude.
Right.
This obviously you and your family are not.
Right.
But why are Americans so obese? I said, our food. Our food. I think that is the primary driver of why we're seeing so much poor metabolic health. And, couple that with a few other things that I've alluded to. But, when I think about what has changed so dramatically over the past 25 years, rise of the processed food industry, because it's just continued to grow. Seed oils are cheap. I understand why. Intellectually, I understand why they proliferate. But combine that with the perfect storm of, social media. People are super sedentary. They're gaming all day long. They're less physically active. Just thinking about, the sleep issues that people think it's normal. Like I met someone recently who hasn't slept well in 10 years. And I was like, if I don't sleep well for 2 nights, it's a problem.
Oh, yeah. One night, I'm diving deeper. What's going on here?
Exactly.
Yeah, I can't repeat this.
No. And I have a puppy at home, and I was telling my husband, I can't wait to go to LA because it means I get to sleep 3 days for 8 hours of sleep and not just 6.
Jeez.
But having said that, I think that we have considered what is considered to be abnormal is now normal. So that's why I think people become outliers. Like the older you get, you'll see this, Chase. The older you get, people will be like, you look so good for your age. Well, why are they saying that? They're saying that because the norm has become so abnormal that anyone who looks relatively healthy, it's like, oh, well, that's unusual.
To pick up on that point, I want to go back to what you're talking about with hormone therapy. What's the word I'm looking for? Excuse me.
Hormone replacement therapy?
No, with, oh my gosh, Chase, you're an idiot right now. Should I keep this in and let the people know how dumb I am?
Not dumb. We all have
birth control, excuse me.
Yes.
So in that same kind of light of this has become the new normal, birth control, I'm not a woman. I've never been through it. I don't know. My wife was on birth control. I've been with other partners on birth control. And I've seen a lot of different variances of types of birth control, benefits to it for personal reasons, for actual just birth control, but other hormonal balance and just lifestyle choice. And I've seen, some really interesting side effects from that. And I do think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think there is a new normal for a lot of women, if not most women, at a very young age to just start on birth control for those general purposes. But what you were talking about earlier of the real specific female need for these unique hormones in certain levels in those key muscle building years, why is that the new normal now? And what would you do differently if you were, let's say you're the chief education officer for all young women to go down this path or not go down this path? How would you kind of lay out these other benefits of not using birth control?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think what we're really speaking to is fully informed consent. I do not believe, nor am I accusing any of the GYNs over the years that prescribed me oral contraceptives, but I don't even think they thought about it. It was just, this is a solution to a problem. I have mild PCOS, and so the solution to fix my wonky periods was to put me on the pill. Not realizing you're not actually getting a menstrual, you're not actually even having, it's like breakthrough bleeding is what ends up happening. You're not really having a menstrual cycle. But for a lot of women, they have the first 10 years they're getting their menstrual cycles. They're abnormal, they're heavy, they have terrible cramps. It's a solution to a problem. And so I get that. And intellectually, I understand that. But I think now that we know so much more, and there's so many other options, but I go back to, I'm the parent of all boys, but I think about if they were girls, I would want them to have reliable, easy to use contraception and allow them to have the decision-making ability to decide when they want to become a parent. I think that is paramount. Like that supersedes anything I'm about to say.
Now, is that mostly because of what is blocked because of long-term birth control use in terms of the other muscle building and hormonal balance?
Well, I think so. I think the biggest thing is understanding that most oral contraceptives, when you take them, they're blocking communication between the brain and the ovaries. That's what prevents pregnancy. It's an untoward side effect that probably isn't discussed often enough, is that if you are kept, and a lot of women just take the pill for 2 or 3 years. That's different. I was on the pill for a long time, like most of my girlfriends were, for the same reasons. But it's understanding that the long-term sequelae of having low hormone levels, because you're keeping estrogen low, you're keeping the sad, cruel fact is your testosterone plummets, so you have no sex drive. But
Which,
you're not
most
pregnant.
women don't realize how vital healthy levels of testosterone is for them.
So your estrogen and testosterone are kept low. And understanding, and you're also, when you're taking oral contraceptives, they are synthetic contraceptives. They are not bioidentical. The other thing is we know, and Dr. Felice Gersh talks about this a lot. She's a GYN actually in Southern California. She talks about that they're endocrine disrupting chemicals. So no one says to patients, oh, by the way, here's the side effects, and it impacts the gut microbiome. And we know so much about the gut microbiome now and how that is it's like this massive domino effect. So to get back to your original question, I think if someone had sat down and explained that to me, I would have been like, no, my periods are wonky. I mean, this is you're emotionally immature as a teenager, young adult, and you're thinking like, I want to have reliable birth control, or I want to get regular cycles, even though they're not a cycle. So I think it's a dual-edged sword. I think it's understanding that there were so few options at that time, but understanding young women now, there are other options. I think that obviously if someone's in a monogamous relationship, that makes those decisions easier. What's also interesting, if you look at the research on oral contraceptives, is that it changes who you're attracted to.
What? How?
Because it's the pheromones are changed. So, pheromones are these natural chemicals that we make. And so I'm grateful when I say this that, I met my husband when I was on the pill and went off the pill fairly quickly. We then got married and I'm still attracted to him.
Yeah.
But understand you attract different partners.
That immediately made me think, what is birth control ruining relationships and people don't even realize it?
I don't know. That's a good question.
You're on birth control and you find this one person attractive, you get off, and for
And then
whatever reason, you're not.
Right. Yeah.
Or vice versa.
And I don't know enough about, continued research in that area, but you start to understand synthetic hormones have lots of effects. And, if you're taking the oral contraceptives for a specific purpose, of which, again, no judgment, I was on them for a while, but you think about the long-term effects. Like I think back, like had I known at 20 that I was going to miss out on opportunities to build healthy bone and muscle, because I'm always been kind of a lean, thin person. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of effort to build muscle. Some of that's genetics. I understand that. But I think about I missed all those opportunities. Yeah. No one counseled me on that.
How could you effectively inform somebody, a young woman, teens, early 20s, beginning to go down this path, who is not interested? Maybe they don't have a workout routine. They don't strength train. They don't yoga. They don't whatever. How could you convince them of this is an important factor to at least consider?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to the first site in our bodies that become insulin resistant are our muscles. That is how important muscles are. It's not just about aesthetics. I think many of us, myself included, used to believe it's an aesthetics thing. That's why we lift weights. You want to look good in whatever you're wearing, but understanding that it is metabolic currency. So helping people understand, we have this metabolic health crisis. We know 92 to 93% of us are not metabolically healthy. How do we starve that off? Maintain muscle. It's that easy. And so, even my teenagers understand this. They're teenagers, and so they like to be buff and muscular. But I'll say to them, you are allowing yourself to be able to have a great more latitude with what you eat. You are, your basal metabolic rate is that much higher. It means you are that much healthier. And so I think when you're communicating with a patient, or if I'm communicating to listeners, it's finding out what's important to them, and then using that as an opportunity to talk about and reinforce why strength training is so important, why adequate protein intake is so important. I think, unfortunately, for so many people, they never have those conversations. And I think traditional allopathic medicine, again, not being critical of them, they're thinking safe, effective, no pregnancy, periods get better, less complaints from patient, done. I think about the 3 nieces that I have and all the other young women that I know, and I feel strongly that these conversations have to be had so that their metabolic health is protected. I think that's so important.
Absolutely. I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's just my little corner of the world. I feel like with all of the information and content and access to information about metabolic health, longevity, muscle being important for health purposes beyond just what you look like and how much weight you can move, I feel like we're kind of getting there. I don't know, but I feel like using that with other information as true sex ed, beyond just your sexual health, contraception, and all of that. Here are other factors to strongly consider that play a role into how you treat your body, how you navigate being with a partner. It's so much more than just that act. It's so much more.
Right. And I think it's interesting for me, retrospectively, to look back over the course of, all my close girlfriends, because we talk about these things now, and I'm like, all of us got started on the pill so young, but for good reasons. I mean, obviously my periods were totally wonky, and I had other friends who had terribly painful periods, but then you stay on it because you're it's convenient. I don't have to think about it.
It becomes habit, becomes routine.
Correct.
It's just what you do.
Correct. Yeah. And it was funny, when I went off the pill, when I got married, I remember saying to my husband, I don't have bad PMS. I had terrible PMS when I was on the pill. And I said, I actually didn't have bad PMS. It was the synthetic hormones, just that wash of, the breakthrough bleeding that you would get in between different, packs of pills. But I was like, holy cow, I felt like a different person.
Let me ask you then, what is currently talked about more than you think needs to be? What is overhyped in health right now?
Oh, let me think. What do I think is overhyped? I think that there is a great deal of overemphasis on minutia. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. focus on the macros. When I say the macros, think about the big things. Like
not macronutrients.
No, sorry, I want to clarify. Focus on the big things instead of the small things. So we have people who choose not to change their diet, choose not to exercise, don't prioritize their sleep, don't manage their stress, and they're focused on infrared sauna, or they're focused on cryotherapy, or they're focused on cold plunges, or they're focused on.
I love this. I love this.
They're focused on things that I think of as more advanced strategies. Like until you dial in on the big things, like don't worry about the small stuff.
They're focusing on optimization when their baseline is so far off center.
Right. And I tell everyone, the first thing to focus in on is sleep. If I can't get you to sleep through the night, I can't fix anything else out. And what I find fascinating is I have this platform where people are communicating with me or my team every day. And I can't tell you every day, in fact, we laugh about this. One of the most common questions is, I can't sleep through the night. And I know you've said that I shouldn't fast if I can't sleep through the night, but, and I always say like,
answering their own questions,
right?
solving
It's
their
like,
own
well,
problem.
then it tells you shouldn't be fasting.
Yeah.
But I remind them that it is so foundational to our health that if you are choosing to go, you want to do your ayahuasca tour, you want to cold plunge, you want to do the cryotherapy, like I want to do my IV drips.
Yep.
And I'm like,
yep.
Yes, you're doing everything you can to deflect attention from the big things that will have the largest net impact on your health.
Because when I post me in the sauna or in the cold plunge
it's sexy,
or doing
it's
plant
cool.
medicine, it's better than here's me asleep.
Right. And that's why I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think that well-meaning companies that are out there, I mean, I believe that they're well-meaning. They have all these gadgets and fun. And I love gadgets. I do, truly. I'll talk about my Oura Ring. I'll talk about my watch. Yes,
Apple
I love
Watch,
these. Exactly.
smart
I love
bed.
all the metrics. But everything else is so dialed in that it makes sense. Like, don't add in a gadget or do advanced biohacking strategies when you haven't done the basics. Like someone said to me, it's majoring in the minors.
Ooh, yeah, absolutely.
And so I can't remember who said that, but I want to give them credit. But it's so true that this is what we do as a culture because the bright, shiny objects are far too fun. You know, like you said, it's not sexy to take a sleep mask photo or mouth tape on. And
who wants to watch a reel of sleep? I mean, I'm sure there's probably some people out there,
right?
But you know, when you scroll through social media, especially these days, at least in my feed, it's all of that.
Yeah.
It's all of that.
Right. And I think the other thing is most of what I recommend that are the big picture things probably don't cost anything. Whereas all these minor things cost money. And when someone is trying to make these changes, I'm like, I would rather you invest in better quality food. Honestly, I would rather you do that before you worry about, you know, and I love Dave Asprey, but before you worry about like Dave Asprey's like newest, hottest thing that he's talking about, you know, the acupressure mat that someone sleeps on. I'm like, well, that's great, but let's focus on these other things first because they are going to, not only from a longevity perspective, they're going to have greater weight, but far more impactful than the little tweaks like, oh, I want to burn more fat, so I'm just going to fast for 5 days. No, please sleep.
Let's pick up there a little bit more. Where do you think the general public can start for optimizing sleep? And by optimizing sleep, I mean getting quality, consistent sleep. Before you get into tracking, hacking, any of that stuff, where can the general public start for better sleep?
Oh, well, you have to prioritize sleep. So that's number one. Like really, you have to prioritize going to bed earlier than you think you need. So I've had to train, I've not trained my husband, but I've had to convince my husband of the worthiness.
We need training. We need training.
He's a night owl, so he'll stay up late, like watching a hockey game. And I'm like, you need to go to bed. So the first is the acknowledgement that you need more sleep than what you're getting. So that's number one. Number two is creating the perfect environment for you to sleep in. You know, we were laughing about this before we started recording. You actually, if you look at the research, 65 to 67 degrees is supposed to be optimal for sleep quality. So drop your thermostat, you know, make sure it's dark. You actually have photoreceptors, not just with your eyes, but on your skin.
Everywhere.
And those light clocks, they pay attention to that. They'll slow down the secretion of melatonin, and that's very important. I also think about getting off of electronics. It seems trite, but like how many people tell me, oh, I take my laptop to bed. I'm like, what? My laptop never comes to the second floor of my house, ever, 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 ever for that purpose. They take their iPad to bed. They take their phone to bed. And I said, get off Kindle, read a physical book. Do something the hour or two before bed so you are setting yourself up. Again, you notice none of these things cost anything. I think the other thing that I consider is, some people do well with raising their core temperature before bed, like taking a brief hot shower. Some people do well with wearing socks before they go to bed because it just kind of primes their body for, sleep induction. I don't like wearing socks to bed, so occasionally I'll take that shower.
I hate it. It's so weird.
Yeah, my feet need to be free.
Yeah. It's like I hate having my sheets tucked in too. I need to kick it off and I need to loose. I'm like that old Seinfeld episode. It's like one tuck, one no tuck. One tuck, one no tuck.
Anytime my mother comes to visit, she does like hospital corners. I'm like, you're killing me. I'm like trapped.
I had to do that in the Army. Maybe that's why I'm so anti-tucked now. It's just like, no, drill sergeant. Kicking it off.
It makes complete sense. But those are the things I think about. Not eating 3 hours before bedtime because we know that can be incredibly disruptive.
Why not eating 3 hours before bed?
So again, we have these circadian clocks throughout our body, and many of them reside in the digestive system. And so if you eat a large bolus of food right before bed, your body's like, time out. I don't need to secrete melatonin. I've got to process this bolus of food. So it's going to increase cortisol. It's going to keep you up later. And we know that the other thing about not eating so close to bedtime so it disrupts sleep, we know we're less insulin sensitive at night too. So maybe that's not an issue until you're closer to middle age. But I do know for most of my patients that are north of 35, 40, it becomes a larger issue. And so being conscientious about if you're eating not so close to bedtime, making sure you understand like what should your macro breakdown be like to kind of optimize sleep. It's generally not eating like a big, Ben Greenfield may disagree with me because we've had conversations about this. Most people are not eating like a big bowl of pasta and going to bed. Like that's not going to work out well for them. Meal timing is certainly important. That's not the time to scroll your inbox at work and get stressed out. That's going to also, dysregulate your melatonin and cortisol as well. And those are like the very basic things that I find we think about a lot and are very intuitive to us. But when I'm talking to patients, they're like, oh, cold bedroom? Oh, it's been hot in my bedroom. It's, typical Virginia summers. It's like a sauna. Yeah. Those kinds of things can be very impactful, cost nothing. And those are things I would suggest doing before you add supplements. Certainly there's lots of other like tricks to the trade before you.
Yeah, let's say they got the baseline stuff covered down. Now we want to get into what is a supplement or two, what is a biohack, what is a next level thing I can do for sleep optimization.
I would say that, there's a couple things. I think that depending on what age you are, there are supplements that I've had really good success with that are inexpensive. Myo-inositol is one in particular that has completely changed my sleep quality. And I actually titrate it up and down, which means some days I need more, some days I need less. And part of that's...
Do you do that based on biofeedback, kind of like inventory of other things you've done, maybe like caffeine, energy levels?
Yes,
okay,
absolutely. And I'm a fast metabolizer of caffeine. So for me, some days I'm like, I've been traveling. I probably haven't been as dialed in with things. Maybe I need a little bit more. I think about things like L-theanine and GABA were like really easy. And again, I can titrate them up and down depending on what I feel like I need. I do that before I start getting more down into the weeds of supplements. Like I've gotten so savvy with supplements that a lot of it's intuitive with certain patients, but so savvy. I probably now am better with supplements than I ever have been. And so I think about adaptogenic herbs, if that's appropriate. If someone's dealing with a particularly stressful circumstance, ashwagandha, relora, rhodiola are all great for sleep, very supportive. They're very tonifying, so they're helping to buffer cortisol, which is certainly very impactful.
What's your thoughts on magnesium?
I love magnesium. I was about to say magnesium. So there's different formulations of magnesium. And the joke is with cardiology, we did so much electrolyte repletion that I learned from the electrophysiologist, so the special cardiologists that dealt with arrhythmias. And so I learned all of their tricks and adopted them into my practice. And so magnesium, two ways. I like magnesium transdermally, meaning I like it sprayed on the skin. I also like oral magnesium. And that is one of the best ways to buffer.
Is it just because of like absorption and bioavailability?
Huh. And because how many people don't know that they're taking a poorly absorbable form of magnesium? I'll give you an example. Magnesium oxide. You absorb about 10, 11% of it. It's like a garbage. We used to give it out in the hospital all the time.
Now, is that because of the form of it, or or
it's the form.
Combination with most people? It's like we're in a very poor gut health.
Yeah. No,
this
is purely based on that formulation.
Okay.
So if you have magnesium oxide at home, toss it in the garbage. What I do like, and I actually just interviewed someone on the podcast who said that, and she's a physician, all magnesium is absorbed across the blood-brain barrier. It's not just magnesium L3 and 8. So I want to just point that out.
Is that true?
That's what she told me. She said, actually, the people that did the research around magnesium L3 and 8 that got the patent have been able to kind of extrapolate their study, which wasn't actually like a good study. I haven't looked at the study, so I want to be really clear about that. But there's no reason for her to kind of identify that.
Yeah, I want to explore that a little bit more. I mean, in my off time, but I've always heard it's mostly certain forms of magnesium in conjunction with other electrolytes. They kind of need like a transport to go there.
Especially potassium.
Yeah. Now, definitely magnesium 3 and 8 crosses on its own.
Correct. So magnesium L3 and 8, and there's other I'm not going to tell you. I'll tell you off air because I've got something in the mix. But magnesium L3 and 8 is great for sleep support because we know it crosses the blood-brain barrier. I have a lot of women who tend to be like constipation motivated, demotivated, unable to have a bowel movement every day. And so magnesium biglycinate or glycinate can be very effective for both sleep support and bowel tolerance. The wonderful thing about magnesium is that the worst thing that's going to happen if you take too much is you get loose stools. And that's what I used to tell my patients. Well, we know you've taken too much but it's not something that's going to hurt you. And it's self-limiting. It goes away. But I also think about when I'm working with women, helping them understand that if we really want to get your magnesium levels up, we're going to use transdermal magnesium. Like Ancient Minerals makes a great spray. I have no affiliation.
I heard of the brand,
with them.
not that particular product.
Yeah,
but I've heard of them.
and they even have if you have sensitive skin, they even have a sensitive skin formulation. But I usually do that and oral magnesium.
Okay.
I think it's very efficacious. It's very cost effective. That's usually what I play with, and then I'll go beyond that. If we've looked at magnesium and we've looked at melatonin and their melatonin levels, we make less of it north of 40, and it's a master antioxidant. It's not just a hormone. I think a lot of people forget that. This can be controversial.
Melatonin's an antioxidant.
One of the biggest ones.
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, and so making sure we have adequate amounts of melatonin is super important. And I think for a lot of people, it's helping them understand we make less with age. I don't have any problems with any of my patients taking melatonin.
Regularly?
Yeah. My 16-year-old taking melatonin, I'm usually chasing him out of the pantry because I'm like, you make plenty. But helping people understand that melatonin can be helpful. And then especially for middle-aged women, the use of estrogen and progesterone can be life-changing. When I take an intake form for a client, I can tell before I even get to the page who's taking HRT and who's not, because there's no reason. Kind of the hearkening for women's fertility is ovarian aging. And one of the first signs is we have less circulating progesterone. That can show up as poor quality sleep, shows up as anxiety and depression, mood disorders. It's a pretty simple fix, right? I mean, your ovaries are making less of it. Our ovaries are as old as we are versus men making sperm every 3 days. Yeah. Helping people understand that oral progesterone can be a total game changer for sleep, and really starting at a low dose and kind of monitoring, and then later maybe adding in some estrogen.
Now, does that mean it needs to be taken at night to support better sleep, or can you take it anytime?
No, you would fall asleep. So I always say, take it when you're ready to get into bed. It works so quickly. So micronized oral progesterone is super cheap, super inexpensive. It would cost you $5 a month. That's how cheap it is.
And you just get it over the counter?
No. Prescription.
Okay.
But there's also compounded options. And so I always like to point out if the cheap oral stuff that you can get at the pharmacy works, great. Don't even go to plan B. A lot of my women need a sustained and an immediate release. And so the compounded can be very, very helpful.
You brought up HRT, hormone replacement therapy. And I know this is a big part of your work, specifically with women over 40.
I would say perimenopause can start 5 to 10.
where the hormones could be the issue.
Yeah. What's interesting is a lot of the HRT experts will say don't draw labs. It's more about symptoms. I personally like to look at labs, but that's I'm very quantitative. I like to look at things. Typically you want to look at an estrogen level on day 3 of a cycle. You want to look at progesterone on day 19 through 20-ish, 21. That may not be feasible for everyone, so I'll just disclose that up front. I do think doing labs is always helpful to look at other things. Common symptoms that we will see in early perimenopause, sleep disruptions, mood disorders, heavier cycles.
Inexplicable, right?
Yeah. And for some women, it's really, they feel badly the week before their menstrual cycle. And that's when, the 5 to 7 days. Some of those women just need progesterone that week. And it could be that easy. One day out of the month, you take oral progesterone and, you feel a whole lot better. But it becomes this relative estrogen dominance. So that means as the ovaries are producing less progesterone, you get this relative imbalance between estrogen and progesterone. And they're really designed to like a seesaw. And so when that happens, you can start seeing breast tenderness, heavier cycles. I used to call them crime scene periods. You can sometimes see.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was not fun. Crime scene periods, you might be weight loss resistant. So this is when women they feel bad, they're not sleeping, they get prescribed antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents. They're put on the pill because that'll fix the problem. They're offered an IUD, an ablation, sometimes a hysterectomy if things are really over the top. And the unfortunate thing is what women are not counseled on is that when you have a hysterectomy, even just a partial, meaning your ovaries are left, it will hasten your menopause transition by about a year and a half.
Wow.
And so that's significant. If it were 2 months, I would say, not a big deal. But women are not being properly counseled on these things. And I always like to say, I had all of the above and didn't know any better. And I think that's kind of what got me so invested in helping educate women and men so that they know, you're not losing your mind. You're not having a midlife crisis, that these things are real. But those are the most common things that we see. Obviously, some women start experiencing joint pain. People end up with a frozen shoulder. Sometimes women will start having digestive issues. They develop food sensitivities. They're having a lot of bloating, just all sorts of unpleasant constellation of symptoms. Brain fog is another one, which if you've ever tried to recall something in your brain and it doesn't come very fast, that's not a fun feeling either. And
I think that was me at the beginning of the podcast. Couldn't remember birth control.
Yeah. Well, it's just one of those things. So I think that throughout a woman's lifetime, there are missed opportunities for helping educate. So I'm sure even though your lovely wife is in her early 30s, maybe because of the work that she does, she'll be thinking about those things. But most of us had no idea.
Right,
no one ever had a conversation with us. So we had to figure it out ourselves.
What are the primary lifestyle changes, lifestyle recommendations you would give a female who is maybe experiencing some of these things you just talked about before considering HRT?
Yeah, I would say you got to dial in on those things. Sleep. You got to try to sleep in a colder room. Try to wear a face mask. Try to make sure that you're disconnecting from electronics at night. Try to make sure you're not eating right before bed. Easier said than done. Try to manage your stress. Especially if you're already dealing with less circulating progesterone, you're going to feel more anxious. You might feel more sad.
You have to really work.
You have to work. And this is
de-stressed.
where I said it does not mean 5 minutes of meditation once a week. It could be that you walk in nature in the morning. It could be that you ground, your feet. It could be that instead of doing CrossFit, you're now transitioning to do more yoga. And by that, I mean not Ashtanga yoga. I mean yin yoga or
a wind down flow. Yeah,
right, exactly. Like a slow flow, which
something
is
that ends in a sound bath.
Right,
too.
exactly.
Bonus,
that would be great. And then, unfortunately, we have to talk about anti-inflammatory nutrition, and people really don't like this. I always use the example of Whole30 is a great thing to do for a month, not forever, but pulling out the most inflammatory foods. So gluten, grains, dairy, soy, alcohol. Alcohol is a big problem for a lot of people.
Beyond the obvious of becoming an alcoholic, I guess, why do you think alcohol is so problematic for most people?
I think there's a huge mommy drinking culture that we don't talk enough about. I certainly experienced a lot of that in Northern Virginia. I would go to these mom club things, and it was insane the amount of alcohol. I would literally, they'd say, "Why aren't you drinking?" I'm like, "Because I have to see patients in the morning, and I have to have my mental faculties really sharp."
Welcome to the South.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. I mean, you should see how it is with the teenagers. It's unbelievable.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. It's unbelievable. Like, it scares me. Like, we've worked out a system with my oldest. Just, we're like, this is what we do. No questions asked.
Okay.
Safety comes first. So I think about that anti-inflammatory nutrition piece, and a lot of women drink alcohol before bed to wind down. I get it. But it disrupts your sleep and exacerbates it reduces your REM, it reduces your deep sleep. It was the only thing that provoked hot flashes in me ever. And so I just was like, we don't drink alcohol anymore. That works for me. I'm not suggesting that has to be the case for everyone else.
Can they just go from, lowering consumption? Can they go from same consumption
Absolutely.
to, more time before they go to bed?
Yes,
what's the kind of titration down from that?
I think it's get honest with yourself. If you're drinking 2 bottles of wine in an evening, absolutely. Just being conscientious about consumption, quantities, I think that can be very helpful. Don't drink by itself, have a meal with it, so you're going to slow the absorption. Alcohol is processed like a toxin. I think it's just important just to say, without judgment, just being conscientious. I think the other thing is that for a lot of individuals, like when you say go gluten and dairy free, people are like, all my fun foods. Like, what are you talking about? No ice cream, no cheese. Dairy seems to be one of the biggest sticking points for a lot of middle-aged women, largely because I think there's a degree of addiction. And when I use the term addiction, it lights up our brain in very pleasurable areas. And so it can be very challenging for people to cut those things out. But it allows you to build awareness around what might be driving some of your symptoms.
Right, yeah.
But I do find gluten and dairy seem to be like big offenders for most individuals. And then quite honestly, swap out the CrossFit, stop doing all the CrossFit and the Orange Theory Fitness 5 days a week and wondering why you're weight loss resistant. You need to start lifting some weights.
Explain why.
Well, now, when you're in your 20s and 30s, I think you can get away with a whole lot of hormetic stress. So talking about beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time, what I find for a lot of individuals is that as they're navigating their 40s into their 50s, or even late 30s into 40s, that load of cortisol, I mean, that is... You end up becoming in this catabolic state unless you are really managing the strenuous degree of activity that you are doing. Like, I used to do CrossFit-like activities in my late 30s, early 40s, and I had to stop doing it because it would just burn my adrenals out. I didn't recover as easily. I was finding that I was sore for a long time. I was finding that I was really struggling with sleep, too much intensity for too long a duration of time. I'm not suggesting that listeners not do intense exercise. It's the time, it's the period of time over time. And for a lot of people, they're still working out like they did when they were 22, and our bodies change, and not in necessarily negative ways. It's just I work out smarter. And I think it's that. And I would also say, before you even consider HRT, think about eating less often, or compressing a feeding window, or even 12 hours of digestive rest. I think as a culture, we have just been so indoctrinated into eating and snacking all day long, and we just don't realize how detrimental that is to our metabolic health. And understanding what happens when we eat certain types of foods. Like, as an example, fat is the most negligible effect on blood sugar, versus carbohydrates are going to have the largest impact on blood sugar. And so if you're sitting down and eating a big bowl of pasta with no protein, guess what's going to happen? That's going to happen very differently than if you sit down and have a steak with some broccoli with a little bit of butter. I mean, that's a very different blood sugar response. And so helping women understand what are the macros that are going to be most beneficial, putting them together properly, and not eating too frequently. Like, I don't even necessarily jump immediately to intermittent fasting for these individuals, but maybe 12 hours of digestive rest. That might be a lot for them to do.
Yeah, why this longer period of our bodies not needing to break down and metabolize and digest food? What benefit does that have?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a very basic level, it's understanding that...
Yeah, let's pull out from, late 30s, 40s women, considering HRT, let's say general population.
Yeah, general population. So intermittent fasting is not appropriate for teens or individuals who are still growing. So sometimes, you'll see 19, 20-year-olds that are still getting taller, gaining muscle mass. So when we're looking at adults in general, men and women, helping them understand that when we are not eating, what is going on behind the scenes is very important. If 92 to 93% of us are not metabolically healthy, that means that our bodies cannot effectively utilize different types of fuel substrates. So our bodies can use stored glycogen, which is stored carbohydrate. They can use stored fatty acids. It's harder to get to the fatty. It's harder to get to the fat. It's very easy. I always liken it to my dad was one of these people that when he filled up his gas tank, he would get to like 3/4 of the tank and he'd fill it up again. and he was like that his whole life.
He believed that by full tank, I get better gas mileage, probably.
It was bizarre. Like the things you look at with your parents.
A lot of guys think that.
I don't fully understand that.
You can't get below half a tank. You get worse gas mileage.
No, I was always like, I don't understand. I wait till mine gets to a quarter
It's
tank.
like your car doesn't have a metabolism.
Correct.
It doesn't quite work that way.
But it's helpful to provide that analogy to say that is how most of us eat. We eat reflexively. We get up in the morning. We're not necessarily hungry. We eat breakfast. We have a snack in between breakfast and lunch. We have a snack in between lunch and dinner. We probably eat after dinner. We're eating all day long.
Because we're bored. Usually.
Correct. Bored and conditioned to eat at certain times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the other piece of that is I also think about the fact that when you help people understand that all you're doing is siphoning off the top of the gas tank when you're eating so frequently. You're not allowing your body to burn off the stored carbohydrates and be able to get to a point where it's working to get the stored fat burned. And this is very much an oversimplification of the whole process. But we want to be able to use both carbohydrates for fuel and fat. We want both. That's called metabolic efficiency.
Metabolic adaptation, I've heard, yeah.
And so helping people understand that when you are going from a standard American diet and being a couch potato to intermittent fasting or 12 hours of digestive rest, you're helping your body along with that process. And as you go to longer periods of not eating, you're allowing your body to go in and look for stored fuel. And that is an oversimplification, but that is how I generally like to explain what is going on behind the scenes.
We're becoming more efficient at utilizing the nutrients and energy we already have.
Right. And that's a very important fact because that's how our bodies are designed to thrive. They're not designed to eat snacks and mini meals and eat all day long. And I think the last time I looked at some research, it was saying the average American eats 10 to 12 times a day.
I might be close. I don't know. Maybe like 8. Yeah, like snacks here and there kind of thing. But
you're metabolically healthy.
That, and I've always been that way, so I feel like there's an innateness in me.
You might just be a snacker.
My grandmother used to say growing up as a kid, she's like, Chase, you have 2 hollow legs. Yeah.
I think I probably have heard similar things. Like we talk about how our kids have 2 dinners, 2 lunches. Like but I think they have a large amount of muscle mass, very likely like you do as well. And, you just got kind of a fine-tuned metabolic engine. But most of us don't have that. And so intermittent fasting can be a way of tapping into those true intrinsic rhythms of the body. It also helps people understand that, as an example, we have something called the migrating motor complex in our gut. And it's like the janitor. The janitor doesn't work effectively or efficiently if we are constantly eating because the janitor can't do his job. And literally, it's like a street sweeper. It's like pushing food forward, bacteria, viruses, things that don't belong. And if that gets mucked up, people are at greater risk for opportunistic infections. And so when I'm talking to patients, I usually say, you really need 4 to 5 hours between a meal. Like you having a snack is different. Like if someone's eating every 2 hours a big meal, I mean, it is really not allowing their body to be.
So 4 to 5 hours between large meals is ideal.
Yeah, that's ideal because that allows that migrating motor complex to do its job. Like, for example, if you've ever heard of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, in many ways we think, SIBO. Not everyone's familiar with the acronym. That's why I was like, I'm just going to say it.
We just had a reference to episode masterclass in this with Rachel Shear recently was on the show.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But helping people understand that we think that one of the mechanisms that gets damaged with SIBO or SIFO is the migrating motor complex is not working optimally. So just as kind of a nerdy side kind of tangential conversation, helping people understand that when we're eating less frequently, we have lowered inflammation. We are able to tap into those fat stores. If we fast long enough, we may actually diffuse ketones across the brain. So beta-hydroxybutyrate, and that's where people have a lot of mental clarity when they're fasted. Like I'm like, this is great. 2 podcasts today, no eating, very mentally clear, not looking for word finding.
Do you ever use exogenous ketones?
I have. I don't think they taste good.
Oh no, they taste like crap.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
I love the feeling I get.
Yes,
Yeah.
I've done them sometimes. I went through a period of time where I did them around public speaking, and then I got to the point where I was like, well, I don't know. I feel the same if I.
I take them for the last 2 years before every podcast.
Oh,
I've missed like 2 podcasts without them.
interesting. Ketone IQ.
Ketone IQ.
Yep.
Shout out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess it was one of those things I thought, I'm very much a taster, like a hyper taster.
Yeah.
So for me, I was just like, I
I
have
love
to
the
take
bite.
it like a shot.
I love bitter things, so
Yeah.
I like it.
Then you probably like vegetables too.
I love root vegetables.
Yeah.
All day long.
That's awesome.
Love it.
That's awesome. But you think about all the other benefits of intermittent fasting: reduced inflammation, improved biophysical markers. If you fast long enough, autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process that goes on with disease, disordered organelles. So there's a lot of benefits that you can see with intermittent fasting beyond just the, I want to lose weight.
I want to get into longevity. What is your approach to longevity? I've had some guests on the show talking about how there is no such thing as anti-aging.
Right.
You can't do anything about it. You can kind of have this different approach to longevity. Basically, anti-aging and longevity are 2 totally different approaches. When you think longevity, what does that mean to you? How do you approach it?
Longevity means I'm going to optimize my life so I live a good, full life. I want to be mobile. I want to be intellectually, cerebrally astute. I want to be able to chase after my grandkids. So when I think about longevity, I'm thinking about fall prevention. I'm thinking about maintaining metabolic health. I'm thinking about maintaining cognitive health. I mean, there are a variety of things that I think about, especially now at 52, that I might not have thought about 10, 15 years ago. I'm like, I am pretty dialed in. I don't love the term anti-aging, mostly because we are denigrating a natural process. Natural doesn't mean optimal, I will say that. But I do think that there's such a over preoccupation with not aging. Aging's a privilege. That's honestly how I look at it right now. I want to see my kids grow up. I want to see my grandkids. I want to be able to continue living a full life. I don't want to be focused on the negative. And so when I think about longevity, to me, that means staying as sharp and vital as I am today, which is why I lift weights, which is why I do balance work, which is why I do flexibility work, which is why I eat the way I do, which is why I prioritize certain things in my life, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I'm now in a point in my adult life that I really only want to be around like-minded people. And I don't mean that to sound like I don't entertain differing opinions. It's just, I look at it as I want to be around other self-evolved individuals. I don't want to be around people that aren't at the same kind of mindset and frequency that I'm at. Like, I'm a big believer in energy work.
Absolutely, yeah. Consciousness.
Yes. And so for all those reasons, like when I hear longevity, I think a lot of people like protein restriction and upregulating mTOR and, all these are, all these other like scientific principles. But when I think about longevity vis-a-vis as a human being, those are the things I think about. I don't so much think like I need to eat less protein.
Sauna or ice bath? If you had to pick one.
I prefer being warm, but I make myself do not as much cold plunges, cryotherapy.
Okay.
Because I abhor being cold. And that tells me the things I avoid doing are the things I need to do. And so
you do it more of kind of the mindset approach. I
Yes.
really, really don't like to do this. So I'm
No.
going to force myself to do it.
No.
Rather than you do it for more kind of a physiological reason.
Well, so and there, remember we talked the role of hormesis, beneficial stress in the right amount at this right time.
Right.
I think for me, I get enough hormetic effect from a cold shower or cryotherapy, whereas like a cold plunge for me, I think would be like that hormetic bucket would get dumped. And I know I have friends that love to like sit in that, and I'm like, there are other things I will do for hormesis that they probably wouldn't want to do, but for me, I would do the cryotherapy because it's like taking that medicine. I know I need to do it. It's good for me. Like I have a bunch of cryotherapy set up when I go back, but I'm like, okay, this is what I need to do. It's almost like medicine because it's easy for me to get in the infrared sauna.
What do you think about for the general public? If you were to say blanket statement, I think most people could benefit from either ice bath, cold shower, cold plunge, whatever, or sauna. And
I think it depends on the person, to be honest with you. I think that when
Spoken like a true professional.
Yeah. Bio-individuality.
It depends.
Bio-individuality. So if a woman comes to me and she's weight loss resistant, struggling, if we know that she's got her detox pathways optimized, then I'm not as worried about infrared sauna. But I do like cryo for a little bit of that hormetic like shock value, and also helping them understand that we can beige white fat to brown fat, like helping them understand like what's going on physiologically below the surface that could be a benefit. Versus if I have someone who comes to me and says, I went on HRT and I gained a bunch of weight, I'm like, okay, well, very clearly we need to support, there's some detoxification pathways. And that's where I think, okay, maybe you're in a position where we can optimize doing infrared sauna. I do like both. So I would say that I do like patients doing a combination of, I think, sweating in general. So if you don't have the ability to get in a cryotherapy tank, cold showers. If you don't have the ability to have an infrared sauna at your house, I get that, then just make sure you're sweating. I mean, that's very important. A lot of people will say to me, I don't sweat a lot.
Yeah, you brought up detoxification a few times in relation to heat and to sauna.
Yeah.
Is that more of the angle you like with sauna and heat?
Yeah, I mean, I think sauna can be really relaxing for a lot of people. I think traditional Swedish saunas for a lot of people are just intense. And so when a woman tells me I don't sweat a lot, I'm like, oh, we got something I need to work on here. So
sweating is good.
Sweating is a beneficial thing. That's one of many ways that we get toxins out of our bodies. And people will hear that and they're like, oh, the boogeyman about toxins. We are exposed to on a daily basis, personal care products, environment and food. We are exposed all the time. And from my perspective, I think that being proactive about supporting detoxification, we have phase 1, phase 2 in our liver, phase 3 is in our gut. I see a lot of women who don't have an optimized gut function and their estrobolome, they can't process and package up and get rid of excess estrogen. So it's not just estrogen that they are taking if it's hormone related, or it could just be the estrogens in their environment. And so it's, again, very bio-individual.
We get it a lot from plastics, right? Microplastics.
Tons.
Yeah.
And understanding that
men and women.
Yeah, and that's one of the main reasons why men have low T is exposure to toxins.
Drastic decline in fertility rates.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Dr. Shauna Swan and her book Countdown? That book blew the lid open for me in the world of. I was reading it just around fertility health, but when she dove into microplastics,
they're everywhere.
Holy shit.
Yeah, they're everywhere. And it's interesting to me because when I say the word toxins, a lot of people go, oh, I don't want to hear that. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not problematic. Like, I think it was Fiji water just had some type of article came out. I didn't read the whole thing, but a friend passed it along to me and it was like, don't drink Fiji water. And I was like, why? And it
Get all the Fiji out of the studio. Yeah. Out of the fridge.
They were talking about the microplastics and like some type of fecal contaminant.
No.
Yeah. Honest to God. I'll have to pull it up on my phone.
Well, I'm so glad. I literally just switched to this like super high quality water delivery system. And I used to get Fiji water bottles in the studio. Well, not anymore.
Well, my functional medicine doc was like, you need the trace elements in that. And I was like, not anymore.
Not anymore.
Nope.
Yeah, I'll get them somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just
Element.
Good old Element.
Meditation or breath work? Again, general public recommendation.
Anything that's going to support the parasympathetic nervous system. So autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, most of us tend to be fight, flight, or flee, and less about rest and repose. And so we're always, again, looking for balance. But I would say 95% of my patients tend to be sympathetic dominant. So anything that is going to help get you into the parasympathetic, rest and repose, where your body feels safe, your body's relaxed, personal preference. I think for me personally, I'm much better about doing breath work because I can do it anywhere, anytime. Meditation, I'm like a squirrel. Like I get so distracted when I'm meditating. I have to literally be in like a corner.
Wow.
Because I'm very visual. I can get very visually stimulated, and yeah, I'm not as good with meditation. But I think it really comes down to like what appeals to you most. Yeah. I can do breath work anywhere.
Yeah. What can you consistently do?
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think that's key. Because if I am sitting here saying, I'm in the ivory tower and I'm going to tell everyone what they should be doing, well, that's not realistic. It's like, what are you going to do consistently? That's really the question.
Across the board.
Correct.
Absolutely.
With everything.
Yeah.
What can you do consistently?
So to piggyback off of what we talked about earlier with hormone health, how important is our sex health as it relates to our overall health?
I think that this is not addressed enough, so I'm glad that you're bringing it up in conversation. I think that sexual health is a litmus for many other things in our lives. I think that it's very easy, especially as someone who's married and has kids, to make excuses for not connecting with your partner. It's like you love your partner, you're committed to your partner, you're not making time for your partner. And so, like as an example, we have we used to do date days because we were always like, our kids were young, we had to have a sitter, and like, why should we go out at night? Like, we should have the sitter here when the kids are really active so that the sitter gets tired out.
That's a really good point.
The sitter gets tired out. So we used to do that quite frequently. But making time for your partner is one of the most important things you can do. Like honoring your partner. And I'm not saying like every time has to be sexual intercourse, but having some degree of intimacy. Like, do you have real conversations? Are you really sharing? Are you exploring things that frighten you? Are you exploring things that don't make you feel good? Now, certainly, I know throughout the trajectory of my marriage, there were times like when you have newborns at home, when your kids are really little, you're just exhausted. You need to find other ways to connect. And it doesn't, again, necessarily have to be sexual intercourse, but making time for one another, creating hobbies, things that you enjoy doing together. My husband and I love traveling. That's like one of our big things that we love doing together. We've traveled all over the world. But having said that, I think that a lack of physical activity is a litmus for other things going on. And sometimes it's not that you don't love your partner. It could be like
a lack of sexual physical activity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can be a sign. Sometimes, and certainly these are things that patients share with me. It's painful. They're maybe their partner's not particularly understanding. Maybe they're feeling pressured. And so ensuring that you're having a conversation with a healthcare provider, could there be something physiologically going on?
Right, yeah.
Hormones definitely drive a lot. And unfortunately, I think testosterone gets all the focus. And I think estrogen plays just as much of a role. So younger women sometimes getting testosterone replacement, they're like, oh, this is going to fix my libido. And then they're like, no, that did not fix my libido. So I think it involves like testing, being honest with your partner, and then making time for that connection, because it's very easy, very, very easy for people to get disconnected and not talk about it because they're like, I don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation. And then it just makes it worse. And before you know it, you're not having sex at all. And then that it becomes this kind of like snowball going downhill. Yeah. And so I think that half the battle is having the conversation. Because once you've had the conversation, you're like, okay, this is the elephant in the room that we're not talking about.
Right.
And then getting help if that's indeed needed. I think for a lot of women, and this is important for listeners to understand, that when women go into menopause, as an example, by the age of 60, it's some crazy number, like 70% of women will have something called genitourinary symptoms of menopause, which is a really sexy way of saying they will have symptoms of pain, tearing, discomfort with sexual intercourse. Ooh. So that is normal, related to that loss of estrogen.
Now, is that a temporary thing? It's just through
it's completely reversible.
Transition?
In fact, we all talk about like every woman should be given vaginal estrogen, like probably TMI for your listeners, but just kind of saying.
Thank you for sharing.
No, but I think that if you aren't the person suffering from the problem, there's someone that probably is. But I think it's important to have the conversation.
And they're probably not talking about it.
Right. And then the other thing is, in younger patients, you can have women who get put on oral contraceptives and then they have no libido. That's the saddest thing of all. It prevents pregnancy, but then it plummets your testosterone.
You know what else prevents pregnancy? Not having a libido.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one of the things that's like a dual-edged sword. Like we're preventing a problem, we're also creating another one. So understanding that for a lot of women, there are people who have, I have a college roommate who insisted that she had this genetically mediated issue with low libido. She's like, Mom had low libido, I have low libido. Well, we found out it had nothing to do with that. It was actually she wasn't with the right partner. Now she's remarried and she's very happy. She was like, I thought all these years it was me.
Turns out it was this guy the whole time.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, okay. And I haven't said enough, so no one who listens will know who I'm talking about. But having said that, I think that sexual health is equivalent to mental health, is equivalent to other types of physical health. And we have to bring greater awareness to it, because I think a lot of people live in shame. They're embarrassed. They're uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about it. And it comes from both sides. But I think for a lot of women, it's very easy to get in that cycle of not having sex at all.
On top of everything you just said, which was very informative, and I agree with everything, what could someone do in terms of their daily health to support higher sexual health, better sexual health? Is there maybe something you would recommend in terms of nutrition, supplementation, maybe a different style of exercise? What can they be doing to support general physical health that they could see a carryover into higher libido or maybe just more enjoyment out of the current sexual health, sexual activity they have?
I would say number one, get your sleep so that, you feel like you are well rested to engage in whatever it is that you're interested in doing. In terms of like nutrition, I mean, if you look at the research, there's certain things that they say are aphrodisiacs. I don't per se necessarily think that's the case. I think that the best thing you can do to maintain sexual health, and we know that as an example, like erectile dysfunction is one of the first signs of insulin resistance.
Really?
And yes. And so I was taught
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, 20 years ago, erectile dysfunction is a form of, well, it means you probably have some nitric oxide production issues, but also can be a first sign of insulin resistance because you think about blood flow, you think about sensitivity, all of which can play a role. So I always say like erectile dysfunction is not benign and it should definitely be evaluated. But when I think about the things that are the biggest needle movers, I think it's being comfortable with your partner. So before I would even say like foods or exercise, I would be like, find ways to connect with your partner. Even if you're like, maybe like you're trying to like get your mojo back, like exercise together, make a date together, do things together, do things that bring you both pleasure. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual pleasure, but connect as human beings. Even if you like just snuggle or you take a bath together. I mean, just do things where you feel connected because oxytocin is like one of these.
It depends on proximity and closeness and touch.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think for so many people, it's like if it's like riding a bike. I'm like, you have not forgotten how to ride the bike. You just need to get back on the bike.
You haven't been on it in a while.
Right, exactly. You just need to get back close to the bike, like get back to, snuggling and maybe, you hug so I think that
give the bike a tune up.
Right, exactly.
Before you hop on. Just
exactly.
give it a little
Like maybe you give them pleasure and you kind of like get, just remember it's supposed to be given and received. But I think for a lot of people, it's that they've got to get back in that space of being together and like finding things to do together. In fact, my husband and I used to go do dancing lessons, and we would find things that just you learn together, you're having fun together. Yeah. And I think that is very important because I'm at the stage now where I have two teenagers. One's leaving for college in August. The other will go in 2 years. And so I'm like, I'm going to be half an empty nester. Yeah. And it's just that realization, like if you haven't fostered that relationship with your significant other,
get ready.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's where you see a lot of people get divorced. A lot of
divorce, yeah.
And I don't think it necessarily has to be the case for everyone. So just know that even if you've gotten off course, you can get back on. And as you appropriately stated, like oxytocin is a really powerful bonding hormone and helping people understand like sometimes you just have to be in that orbit to confer. I mean, take a bath. You don't necessarily have to have sex. Like take a bath, be close to one another, touch, and doesn't necessarily have to be, touching specific body parts. It can just be one of those discussions where you're talking about the thing, like, tell me the things you like, tell me the things you want.
Intimacy can start orally and not the way you think.
Correct. And I think that's, for me, rapport, I tell my husband all the time, like, when I'm feeling like I'm being heard, then I'm like, oh, okay, maybe. Like he says, you scratch my back, I scratch yours.
No, like literally scratch my back.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like understanding that all those things, like being playful, like that's very important. And I certainly have seen over the past 20 years, I've seen friends, marriages and things that have happened. And I think the strongest people keep that communication. Like that is the most important thing. When you stop communicating, that's a problem.
I'd like to go a little bit further as we kind of get towards the end in the sexual health world. If you would be comfortable talking about solo sexual health. And you mentioned earlier, men create sperm every 3 days. And that made me think about, I see a lot of sexual health content now where one school of thought is saying men need to masturbate within a certain window of time because without it, you get this buildup of sperm and it's just not a good thing. Like it's actually healthy to release within a certain time window. I'm curious, is that true? And is there a window for women, talking about self-pleasure?
Yeah, I don't know the research on that. Okay. I would imagine that it's as varied as the individual. Like there might be men who have a high sex drive and want to feel like they masturbate in between having relations with their partner. And I'm like, hey, whatever works for you, that's great.
Is it healthy, do you think, at like a daily level, or is it, again, just so individual?
I think it's probably so individual. I mean, I have...
Is healthy even the right word?
Right. I mean, I think whatever is your normal is probably your normal. But I have enough friends who are urologists that over the years, conversations that they've had around me, I've just kind of said, I think it's very bio-individual. I hate to keep bringing it back to that. But I do think that there's a frequency, like whatever the frequency is that drives you or makes you feel good, I think that's reasonable. If it's disrupting your daily routine or you're getting obsessive about it.
Or maybe you're not having sex with your partner because of.
Yeah, that's a problem. Or maybe you're not communicating with your partner and that's why you're not having sex because you're getting whatever fetish you're having in your head. That's what you're thinking about. Maybe you need to be telling your partner. I do find that even with women, talking about masturbation is still kind of this like taboo subject that I definitely had girlfriends in college that would talk openly, but most of them were like, oh, I don't masturbate. I'm like, really? Like, how do you figure out what you like if you don't do that?
Yeah.
So I think that it's very bio-individual. I can tell you I know many women now in middle age that are like, oh, I don't have a libido anymore. And then I have other friends who are like, oh, yeah, we're still having sex. And so I just kind of, I marvel at the
range.
The frequency, the honesty about what they like, what they don't like. I think it comes down to, are you happy in your partnership? If that's working for you, great. The other thing is, I think that certain women, depending on where they are in the testosterone estrogen trajectory, I know many women when they go on HRT, they're like, oh, I have a libido again. This is great. So if you're not on HRT and you're in that age range, like definitely have that conversation because it is not just in your head. I mean, if you don't have your hormones optimized, it is going to make the desire to have sex much more challenging. And jokingly, my husband's always like, anytime, anywhere, I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
And so I think about I think that's how most guys are. They're like, I want to be with my partner. I love my partner. I'm usually just in the background going, I'm just waiting. Whenever you're ready.
Put me in, coach.
Right, exactly. So I think it really comes down to like communicate with your partner, make sure you're both on the same page. And, I think masturbation is, whatever frequency that people want it to be. I think that's such an individual. I mean, I'm still at the stage where like dogs and kids are always coming in. So for me, it's like one of those things, like it has to be a very thoughtful exercise because I'm so rarely by myself, just from that perspective. And I think a lot of people that have kids at home probably feel the same way. They're like, you don't ever want to get caught.
That's why we knock, Junior. We knock before entering.
Oh, I can tell you a funny story. Yeah.
So having been a podcast all about so many health topics, I want to kind of poke at content like this a little bit. Haven't we said it all by now? Is there really anything new about the body and health and stats and attention to metabolic health and longevity and hormone health and all this stuff? Are we just going to keep spinning the wheel? Do we need another podcast about this? Do we need another clip about the top 5 reasons, your hormones are out of balance? Why are we still here talking about this stuff?
Yeah, no, I think that it has to, the trajectory of these conversations is that the more we talk about it, the more focus will come to it. And so my feeling is, like when I think about my podcast as an example, there's certain topics I've talked about 195 times 1,000. And I always say, but they're always still relevant because someone's always looking for a fresh perspective. Someone's always looking for something more nuanced. Someone is there. It's like that endless quest for, like I know my opinions have evolved over time. I'm sure yours have. I'm sure, many of your listeners have. And so from my perspective, it's always like one of these things that I think we just take it for granted. Like we're screaming it from the mountaintops. We're talking about it all the time. Yeah. But it might be the 15th, the 20th, the 25th time someone hears that they're like, okay, now I'm ready. So that's why I think these conversations are so important that, for the long, I don't want to use the word longevity, but for the perpetuality of helping people understand, like maybe they need to hear it 100 more times before they're ready to take action. And that's, ultimately, I think that's our desire, is to inspire people to take better care of themselves, to look more inwardly, to, be open to the possibility that there's something new for them.
Yeah. That lands a lot with me today. Thank you for your response on that.
You're welcome.
It's something that I've been doing this show for over 7 years now. This week, as we're recording, was episode 816.
Wow.
And so I've been doing this for that long with that many repetitions. And then I was sharing with you before, for 4 or 5 years, I did it for a living, in a clinic, working with people one-on-one. So at some point, I kind of begin to question, am I just banging my head up against a wall? Am I saying the same thing over and over? Does the world need another person talking about this? Does the world need another podcast about that? But it's a reminder of the commitment, I guess, we have made as healthcare providers, as wellness professionals, certified health coach, clinical health coach for many years. And it's just kind of like that commitment you've made to wanting to better your life by helping better other people's lives as well. And it's so true, especially nowadays with so many accounts and so many shows and so many this and that, where anybody can log on to anything, anywhere, anytime, and really kind of probably hear the same thing. They can go listen to any show with me on it, any show with you on it, any other show with any other person, but you never know when it's going to land. You never know when that person's going to really be ready to not only listen, but to hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always say when the individual is ready, the teacher arrives.
Yeah, so when the student's ready, the master will appear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I remind myself of, like when I'm like, I've talked about this 595 times. But
I just want to be like, go look at the last 5 years of the Actually, don't go back to the first 2 years. I don't like to promote those. I was still very new, but just, I guess that's the beauty of having evergreen content, right? You always have a resource for somebody.
I always tell people, I'm like, don't listen to the first 60 episodes.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely not the first year for me. I was such a noob. I was messing up everything. One other question here before I get to my final question. And again, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show.
Absolutely.
It's so great to connect with you. Have you ever been wrong? And if so, what did you do to correct it, particularly in your healthcare career?
Oh, God, yes, absolutely. There were a lot of things that I reflect back on, especially in cardiology, things that I learned and have now unlearned. I would say one of the biggest things was in 2015, probably timeframe, there was a study that came out that was talking about how patients that were taking Lipitor were losing insulin sensitivity. They were more likely to become diabetic. And as a practice, we talked about this, what patients are going to come to us. We have a very educated population. They're going to come to us, ask us, what we think of this. And I didn't read the study because my kids were still little. And whatever the physicians wanted us as a nurse practitioner service to say is what we did. Now I'm really dove into all the research surrounding statins and loss of insulin sensitivity. And this year, I brought on Peter Attia as lipid specialist. We did a 5-series podcast talking about lipids.
5-series podcast on lipids.
Yep. And it was one of the most downloaded of the year. Like, he's amazing. And then I brought on Dr. Dave Diamond, and we talked about the research around statins and insulin sensitivity. And I was like, this is my acknowledgement of what I didn't know. And I get chills when I think about it because I wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of statin prescriptions over 16 years. Thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands.
And you feel like those were collectively unnecessary?
Well, if you look at the guidelines for ASCVD, so our atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and you look at standard of care for statins and myocardial infarctions, heart attacks, it is standard of care. It is evidence-based medicine. What I don't agree with, what pains me enormously, is that how many of those patients became diabetics? How many of those patients became diabetics? And I didn't do enough to help them. That's what I think about.
You could probably find that data. I'm sure somehow.
Yeah.
That would be interesting.
That's what weighs heavily on my heart. So that's why I did this lipid series and dedicated it to all those patients I took care of. I was like, know better, do better.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
So for me, I take that kind of stuff really seriously. I'm like, we used to say things like, we should put statins in the water.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, okay, maybe to your defense, devil's advocate a little bit.
Yeah.
Isn't that the nature of science to some degree? We go off of the best information.
Correct.
With the best clinical, hopefully ethical and pure processes as possible at that time. It's not uncommon for us, 5, 10,
Yeah.
20 years later to go, oh, with new science, new evidence, no.
Yeah. I mean, and let me be clear, like this was evidence-based medicine, but it still weighs heavily on me because, the concept of know better, do better. And it would have been medical malpractice in those circumstances not to appropriately prescribe statins, given the guidelines as they were at that point in time. But I think that, statins are not benign. And that's the point I was trying to make. Having said that, if you understand physiologically the way that they work and now really look at the research, you can see how essentially it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul.
So your cholesterol and lipids are looking great, but now potentially you're a diabetic and
women are at greater risk for developing
Really?
diabetes while on statins. And that's the kind of stuff that weighs very heavily on me. So again, know better, do better. And that's why I feel like, the lipid series, I'm actually bringing on he's a Harvard, Oxford guy. He's like brilliant. That he's coming on. He's a Harvard med student right now, but just really brilliant and progressive. And we're going to have some really good conversations because to me, I look at it as, know better, do better. I got my mom off of statins in conjunction with her physician. Let me be clear. I'm not telling anyone to stop their meds. Didn't get my dad off, but he was like very tunnel vision and wasn't willing to accept an alternative perspective.
And that's a whole other area we didn't get into. You very, comfortably shared that information. And, your father recently passed away and, you seem to think that it was because of, or there are a lot of reasons you think that you could have maybe helped make that not happen.
Yeah. And it's those kinds of things that, ultimately he's no longer suffering and that's the most important thing. But, as someone who is a clinician and a human being, it's like, there's a lot we could have done differently.
Yeah. It really reminds me a lot, unfortunately, of Casey's situation, Dr. Casey Means, and her mother.
And that was rapid.
Yeah. From, fine to not.
Yeah.
And for a lot of potentially preventable, or at least we could have been aware of things and done a lot more to not get here, at least not so quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, what you were phrasing again? No more, say again? You were saying no more, do more?
Yeah, know better, do better.
Know better, do better, ever forward. I'll piggyback on top of that. What do those two words mean to you, Cynthia?
Oh gosh, I mean, I'm someone that's always looking for, the bright side in any situation. That's my practical optimism. That's just part of who I am as an individual. That I take whatever the circumstances are, and I'm always looking ahead to see how is this going to help benefit me, someone else in the future. Never fretting about the journey, understanding that, things all kind of fall into place ultimately, but I'm never looking back. I'm always looking forward.
And like we also share, you're exactly where you're supposed to be, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Well, where can my audience go besides the show notes and the video description box to kind of check out more of your content, website, podcast, all of that? Where are you hanging out the most online? Where can they go to learn more about you?
Yeah, thank you so much. So www.cynthiathurlow.com. You can get access to Everyday Wellness, which is my podcast, which is my favorite thing I do in my business.
It's the best, right? It's the best.
It's my favorite thing I do. I would say probably most active on Instagram, but I'm slowly growing YouTube, so definitely check us out there. We post the full sessions of the podcast, and that's been growing very organically, which has been nice. If you find me on Twitter, I may be snarky, so I'll just preemptively.
Isn't that what Twitter's for? I feel
it is, but it's funny. People say, "But you're so sweet on Facebook and Instagram," and I'm like, occasionally I can be snarky on Twitter.
That was Twitter, Cynthia. Okay.
Yes, I grew up in New Jersey. I can't help myself sometimes.
And speaking of, if you're watching this video on YouTube, thank you. Make sure to smash that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. Had so much growth over the last few months. Thank you all so much for tuning in and continuing to check out the studio vibes here in Santa Monica. And Cynthia, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.